23 years old, I guess I'm technically an adult. I certainly don't feel like one right now. In fact, all I can think about is calling my conservative parents back in the Midwest and pleading with them for help. Oh, what I wouldn't give to just run away all the way back home. I could just imagine myself snuggling up in my childhood bed and pulling the cartoon-styled bedsheets over my head, just to let all my adult problems fade away. Damn it, I can't though. I need to be braver than this. My worried girlfriend needs me to be braver than this. We're both in it together, I suppose. If only I could somehow hide just how terrified I am in front of her. That would probably make Gwen feel better, safer. But no, every innocuous little bump in the night or intrusive ding from either of our phones leaves me visibly flinching each and every freaking time. I just don't know what to do. Maybe I should start at the beginning. I'll tell you what I know, and maybe it will make sense to you. It's possible that I'm overthinking all of this, truth be told. This all started about a year ago today. It was the second week of November, and the rent on my expensive city apartment was already late. The reason? My horrible, self-absorbed, immature, and all-around slimy roommate, Clint. Taking him on as a roommate was the worst decision I had ever made. Always a super spreader of destruction and inconvenience. If only I had kicked him out when I had the chance. Anyway, like I was saying, one Friday evening in November, Clint walks in. Clint always knew how to make a loud entrance, and this time was no exception. He immediately hollered and said, "I got our rent covered, bruh." I was skeptical, knowing his penchant for exaggeration, but I looked up from my phone and noticed how utterly bizarre he looked. In his hand, he was holding a paycheck, and the other arm was fixed to his side in a fresh cast. Obviously, his arm was broken. He was also decked out in some kind of sci-fi or cosplay type outfit. Completely bizarre, even for him. "What the hell happened to you?" I asked. "I got our rent." "Dude, also, I got a lead on a way to make some big bucks," he exclaimed, somehow oblivious to how skeptically I was looking at him. "What happened to your arm?" "Oh, this. It'll heal in no time. I was downtown. There was a protest for higher pay for educators or something. I was there, and it got a little rowdy, but anyway, I got paid." "Paid for what?" I asked. "I don't know. Some recruiting company just told me to show up looking like a goofball and try and draw a bunch of attention to myself during the protest. Then they cut me a check. So cool." I still didn't get what Clint was going on about. I tried to ask for more information, but all he seemed like he wanted to talk about was this new idea that he had. Anyway, I saw Gwen downtown when I was there. I just bumped into her on the street. Did she talk with you about this already? No. I doubted any interaction between Clint and Gwen was purely by chance. He probably happened to drop by the clothing store where she worked. Yeah, so it was right outside of her work. She was talking about how all these rich people come in and buy these ridiculous purses and bags, and I was like, why are these so expensive? Do you know what she said? I was still processing the fact that he saw Gwen today and didn't answer. At least I didn't think so. It's because they control the supply. It's simple supply and demand, bruh. They keep the inventory super low and they are good enough quality that everybody is scrambling to get one, he said enthusiastically. So what? Well, according to Gwen, the brand that makes the purses has its headquarters and distribution centers right outside of the city. The supply is artificially low at the stores. We can just sneak over there before the end of the year, before they destroy their overstocked quantity for the year and grab some. No one would know, and we could sell them secondhand for thousands. I'm talking like 20,000 per purse. I was already calling Gwen after he finished talking. She was supposed to get off soon, and I couldn't wait to talk to her about this strange interaction they had today. Gwen hated Clint, and I couldn't see how they would have this type of conversation. When I finally got a hold of her, she confirmed what Clint had told me. Apparently they had talked vaguely about this, and she was going to talk to me. Nothing illegal, but if they are going to incinerate them anyway, maybe we can grab a few. It'll be a few years before we can actually afford one ourselves, she added. Besides, maybe we can get several and resell them. Who knows? I remember thinking at the time that this was it. I was going to kick Clint out and finally move in with Gwen. Money would be tight for the next year, but I knew it would be fine. I just had to talk her out of this strange scheme that Clint had cooked up so we could start the next chapter in our lives. Well, it turned out that Gwen was pretty adamant about this crazy plan with Clint. I don't know whether it was the allure of this mythical designer bag, the fact she fell for Clint's false charm, or some other side of her that I was unfamiliar with. But eventually they talked me into it begrudgingly. I was now an accomplice in their delusional scheme to save a few designer bags from a premature death. It was 1 week later when all three of us hopped in my scratched-up blue sedan and started the journey out of the city. It took about an hour to make it to the facility, or at least what we thought at the time was the facility. This was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a thick forest and awful roads. The fact that it was night and road lights were spared made for a scary drive. I don't know how people who worked there made the commute safely. Anyway, the facility looked brand new. We parked about half a mile away and made our way to what looked like their warehouse building. It had some docking areas and trucks parked out front. It's a bit eerie to see such a modern marvel in the middle of wild nature, but there it was. Clint was laughing and chatting with Gwen, who seemed really excited about this whole adventure. I guess I was even feeling a bit excited too as we made our way up to the building and started to joke around with them. "Do you think they have a men's section?" I joked. At this point, we figured the whole place was closed, which was odd because it was technically Black Friday. I would assume they would have some sort of nighttime activity in a place like this, but the place seemed closed. It was actually dead quiet until a scream pierced the night. Well, not a scream, exactly. Like a loud squeaking. I couldn't quite place it. "What do you think that is?" Gwen asked Clint as I trailed along. She seemed spooked. "I don't know. It should be around here," Clint said, making no attempt to be quiet and rounding around the backside of the warehouse. "No way," Gwen gasped. The sight that greeted us was so bizarre that I immediately knew we must be in the wrong place. There, tied to a stake in the ground, was a shaking lamb. It seemed to be crying out in the night and looking for something. Maybe its mother. "Who would do that?" Gwen asked. She started to walk towards it before I grabbed her arm. The lamb was tied to a stake in what appeared to be an empty space in the surrounding field. However, looking closer, next to the lamb, probably 20 feet away, were piles and piles of shoes. Like fancy boots and high-heeled shoes. Next to those were scattered dresses and suits. And finally, at the end of these slight rolling hills of luxury, were the designer bags. "What the hell?" Clint said, looking at this scene. The lamb kept crying out, but suddenly an even sharper sound appeared right behind us. "Shulma," a figure said behind us. I turned, and a massive, towering figure looked down at us. He must have been 6'8" and had a long braided beard with what I guess were dreadlocks ending in beads. His hair was pulled back and also in dreadlocks, ending in colored beads with an ornate head wrap covering his forehead. He wore some kind of strange toga or something. All three of us froze against our better instincts. The man repeated what he said, looking at me and then Gwen. "Shulma." Then he smiled. He said some other stuff that I couldn't understand. Then he pointed behind us. We all looked. "Lahar," he said. He repeated it several times. In the distance, behind all the stacks of luxury clothes and the frightened lamb, was a large statue of a woman. I think it was a woman. She stood there in a simple white dress-like toga and held a lamb. "What the fuck?" I said under my breath. When I turned around, Clint was pulling his fist back on his good arm and slammed it into this giant's jaw. The large man fell with a huge thud, slamming his head against the ground. "Clint, what the fuck?" I shouted in a whisper. He then said, "Let's just grab some shit and get out of here. I'll go free that lamb, and you two grab whatever you can," and he was off. I wanted us to run out of there and return to the car. I had no idea what was happening. But what I did know was that I was scared out of my mind. Gwen was shrieking in hysterical fear and ran off to the pile of clothes. Instead of grabbing anything, though, she dove down to hide. I followed close behind her. "Gwen, we need to get out of here. Something strange is going on here," I said to her. I could see tears running down her eyes. Suddenly, Clint shouted, "Got it!" And the lamb was free. It bolted off foolishly into the night. Gwen and I both made our way closer to the building, away from the area with the statue and the clothes. Clint just stood there with a self-satisfied grin on his face. I was about to shout out to him to run, but suddenly Gwen put her hand over my mouth. "Shh," she whispered, and pointed out to the field. Suddenly, 3 more large men, similarly dressed to the first one, were sprinting towards Clint, who hadn't noticed them yet. They tackled him, catching him almost totally by surprise. He had barely enough time to turn his head before they had him knocked out on the ground. "Shit, what do we do?" Gwen asked me, digging her fingernails into my forearm. "I'll call the police. This is insane." That's when I realized I dropped my phone out in the field when Gwen and I started running. It was now located not too far from where they were dragging Clint. "Do something," Gwen shouted in as low of a whisper as she could manage. The 3 men, now accompanied by others, were all dressed in utterly bizarre and anachronistic type clothing. The closest that I could tell was that it was Greek or something. I had no idea. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. We watched the strange people tie Clint to the stake where the lamb was. Suddenly the sound of machinery started up, and we could see some kind of forklift or warehouse machinery pushing the piles of luxury items closer to Clint. "Lahar!" All the people were chanting in unison. There must have been around 20 of them there now. Some were carrying lit torches. "Gwen, we need to get back to the car. We have to get out of here and get help." "Your phone is in the car. We can call for help," I said. Gwen could barely keep herself together, but I think my plan was better than nothing. So I led her back to the car. We found a path around the other side of the warehouse that was dark, that I was fairly sure no one would see us. "It will be okay," I kept saying, mostly to myself, unconvincingly. We finally got to the car that was parked slightly off the road, and that's when it happened. The shouting had reached a crescendo, and massive flames licked up towards the sky. A quick scream. This time, I'm pretty sure it was not a lamb, filled the night air before harshly and suddenly stopping. It was miles before we finally had cell reception, but we just kept driving. We drove in silence all the way back to the city without calling anyone. I don't know whether it was the trauma of what we experienced, but we didn't go to the police until the next day. Gwen was constantly crying, and I just didn't know what to say. Was it some kind of cult or something? I mean, that was definitely a facility for a huge international corporation. What had we gotten ourselves into? We explained ourselves, or tried to at least, first to some bewildered-looking cops. Then we were introduced to a senior detective, who identified himself as Detective Semra, and we recounted everything. He nodded sympathetically as we told him absolutely everything. The detective said not to worry. Everything would be okay. Gwen and I spent the entire Saturday at the police station. Most of it just us 2 together in some kind of conference room waiting for the detective to return. Finally, around 8 p.m., the detective came in and said, not to worry, that Clint was okay. Apparently it was some big misunderstanding, and he was safe back home at his grandparents who lived a state over. "You kids should be more careful. The company had allowed some film crews to shoot some movies out there, and you all stumbled onto that. They agreed not to press any charges. You all should be more careful in the future," the detective said, still with his odd-looking smile. "No, that's not right. It was not a movie," I started to say, but he put his hand up to silence me. "Look, I get it. If anything more comes of any of this, I'll get in contact. I have your information," he said with another smile. I looked down at the floor, searching for something to say, and that's when I noticed them. His impeccable and expensive-looking designer shoes. We've been living with this for over a year now, and we still haven't seen or heard directly from Clint. Clint was unreliable, but he wouldn't just vanish like that. I can't get any of this out of my head. The designer shoes that the detective was wearing, the pathetic crying of the lamb, or the sight of the strange men in their ancient clothing. What the heck am I supposed to do now? saw it when I came back home on a Saturday. It filled up our living room. I nearly screamed, "That is a baby grand piano. I only wanted a keyboard." "I got a good deal on it," Dad said. "I've been wanting a piano forever." Dad replied, "Well, Mrs. Johnson promised to teach you. Just don't waste my money and you better keep your grades up." If it was a trick to get me to have good grades, it worked. I have loved music ever since I was young. I once had a great music teacher who explained a little bit about music theory, and I was hooked. I was able to get into complicated music and understand it at a fundamental level. I learned how harmonies work. I understood why most pop music follows the same chord progressions. The rhythms and melodic combinations are endless. The happy times with the piano did not last long. The first sign of trouble happened when I wasn't there. I came back home one day and my dad was investigating the piano. "What's up, Dad?" "It's not broken, right?" I said. "No. It was just that it was playing." "Did you have some sort of recording to practice?" I investigated the piano. I thought it was just fine, except maybe it needed a little tuning. I was advancing really well on my scales. I thought the C scale was boring, but I loved the minor chords like G and A minor. On that piano, the melodies would echo across the walls, amplifying the sound. Mrs. Johnson was impressed with my progress and said that she loved teaching me. I made her earn her money, unlike many of her other students. During this time, I really didn't do anything else but play piano. It was an obsession, but it was my thing. I excelled at it, and as far as I knew, I was the best piano kid on the planet. I already had a composition to practice, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. While I no longer listen to it, if you haven't heard it yet, you absolutely must. The initial part is relatively straightforward, but as it progresses, the intensity builds and the forceful keystrokes evoke a catharsis seldom found in music. But that's where the trouble really started. I would play for hours and lose track of time. After I practiced, I would see things differently. Blurry would be a good way to describe it. I was so focused at the time on the music, starting right after school and playing until it was already dark. I was covered in sweat and would wake up from playing the piano as if I were angry. I would see candles lit around me. I thought it was my mom setting the mood for the classical piece, but she denied it. "No, I wanted you to focus, so I let you be on your own," she said. That wasn't the only occurrence. Sometimes I would wake up, and around the piano, different paraphernalia would be placed. At times it was candles, always 5 of them placed in a perfect circle around the piano. Other times there was a complicated knot. I showed my dad, and he told me it's a sailor's knot called a monkey fist. It was so intricate, there's no way a novice could have made it. My mother was concerned. "Maybe it's better if you find out more about the piano. I just don't feel right about it. With all the weird stuff, maybe." Dad said, "I got it at the estate sale. It was a good deal, and the kid loves it. Look, I'll find out what I can." When I came back from school, my dad was accompanied by another person. He was some sort of expert, but not like a professor. The guy was wearing all black. I thought he must really like the cure. This was the prize of the sale. "How did I miss this beauty?" the expert said. My dad replied, "Well, you can't have everything. What did you get?" I acquired the rope, the candles, and the note. My dad and I looked at each other and asked, "What note?" The expert answered, "The note to the media." You do know that this was at the scene of the crime. My mom nearly fainted. I could feel my heart stop. I closed my eyes and I could imagine the scene in detail. I saw a person bound and wearing a mask over their head. I saw the candles lit, and then I could see a man pounding furiously at the piano. It was like a bizarre religious service where each motion was a manifestation of some unknown deity, or worse, the devil. I opened my eyes as if the daylight would wash out the ugly scene from my eyes. The expert spoke again. "The spirit of the murderer is here. He escaped this life by suicide. He wants to manifest himself here. I will get the proof." We told him what had happened before. My dad swore he didn't know anything about this. Bragging about the good deal he got did not sound so impressive at this point. The expert continued. "To capture the spirit, I want to set up mirrors to amplify its energy. Then I can expel him from here forever, but only after I have recorded it on camera. My dad said, "This ghost doesn't seem so shy. You'll get your proof." Once the mirrors were placed on the walls, the sun set, and the experiment was underway. The expert told me that it was time to start playing. I had a feeling Mrs. Johnson was not going to be so pleased at my piano, which was used to summon an evil spirit. Soon after the initial part of the composition, we witnessed something horrific. I can't describe the feelings of what was happening, but if you get the feeling in your stomach when you are in trouble combined with the feel of goosebumps on your neck, that is what it felt like. No scientist would ever be able to properly measure that, but it was only the beginning. I heard the steps coming down the staircase, one after the other, louder and louder. Then there was an evil laugh that echoed through the room. I stopped playing. I looked in the mirror and could see the image of the man. I realized at this point that I had envisioned him earlier in the act of his earlier murder. I stood there frozen and watched as the expert started interacting with the being. He was filming it as it approached. Being known as Alex Malcor, surrender to our pleas, Ender. I looked at the expert. This was a murderous spirit, and you are talking nicely to it. I thought, come on, man. Don't you have some better weapon than this? The being stared directly at the expert and gave a smile that signified his evil attention. It approached the expert, picked him up by the neck, and was slowly choking the life out of him. My dad tried to interfere and help him. I told my mom to get out of there. The expert was barely able to whisper out these words. The mirrors broke the mirrors. While my dad and the expert dealt with the spirit, I broke all the mirrors. If this was the way to stop it, fine. But I didn't see how that was going to stop it. But it was working. The spirit was weaker and weaker. I blew out the candles and broke every last mirror. The spirit's energy faded until it was no more. The police were very helpful when they arrived. They had someone from the precinct update the responding officers about the case of Alex Malcor. The ambulance pulled up the body of the expert and took him to the coroner's office. The tape told the police what they needed to see. The death certificate said a heart attack. I called Mrs. Johnson and explained politely that I wouldn't be taking any more lessons. Dad and I took the piano to the backyard and had a good supply of firewood that winter. We haven't spoken about the piano since. When I was a kid, I was friends with a guy named Carl. Carl and I lived in the same neighborhood, went to the same school, and were both huge geeks. Now, this was before the MCU was a cultural juggernaut, so being a geek tended to mean you got your ass kicked, which our local bully Fred made sure to do. Carl and I stayed friends for years, from elementary to high school. It's in high school where everything starts. I found that I had a pretty strong knack for science, especially chemistry. I wasn't Walter White or anything, but I knew my stuff. Carl, meanwhile, wasn't a great student and didn't have too many friends outside of me. He was angry and bitter, causing him to retreat more and more into fantasy. The constant bullying by Fred and his crew didn't help either. He was constantly berated, shoved into lockers, and humiliated by Fred and his cronies. One day, while we were hanging out at my house, Carl asked, "What if we had superpowers?" I laughed. Then we'd probably be able to get laid. I'd punch Fred into next week. I nodded. Honestly, I'd do the same. Fred didn't exactly leave me alone either. Carl then eyed my chemistry set. "What if you gave us superpowers?" Carl said. I looked at him in confusion. "What?" "Well, you're good at chemistry. You can make a super soldier serum or something." I laughed. "I'm serious," Carl said. "You think a high school kid can make you Captain America?" I asked. When you think about it, all Captain America got were super steroids from the 1940s. All you've got to do is just juice up some steroids. Then we can get back at Fred. "Ah," I said. "You don't want to be Captain America. You want to be Captain Columbine." Carl refused to be talked down. Think about it. We'd be stronger, get all the girls, and wouldn't have to worry about creeps like Fred pushing us around anymore. Dude, even if I could do that, that's a terrible idea. There are dozens of comics in which some dorks try remaking the super soldier serum and instead become monsters. I think that's basically Ultimate Hulk's origin. Carl wrapped his arm around my shoulders. But you're not Ultimate Bruce Banner. He's a comic book character, and you're real. Unlike the Super Soldier Serum, which is famously not from a comic book. Carl backed off. Okay, fine. Whatever. I was just joking anyway. We both knew he was full of it, but I didn't push back on it. After he left, I stared at my chemistry set, lost in thought. The next day, Carl, Fred, and I were in chemistry class together. Carl and I were working with a Bunsen burner when Fred walked by and shoved Carl into it. The flames set his shirt on fire, and he fell to the floor, trying to stop, drop, and roll. I got some water and dumped it on him, extinguishing the flames. Despite Fred very obviously doing this, he didn't get in any trouble. Fred claimed it was an accident. No one really challenged him. Carl and I went to a football school, and Fred just so happened to be our team's quarterback. This was in the middle of the season, and no one wanted him off the team. So him immolating my friend was just swept under the rug. What sticks with me is Fred's smile while Carl was burning. He not only knew that he'd get away with it, but he also enjoyed it. Carl went to the hospital where he stayed for a couple of days. I went home and thought things over. On my wall was a Spider-Man poster. I felt those white jack-o'-lantern eyes on his mask bore into me. With great power comes great responsibility. That's the motto Spider-Man lives by. He uses his powers to help those who need it. The thing about that phrase is that when his Uncle Ben told him that, he had no idea Peter had powers. As far as Ben knew, Peter was just a smart kid. He was telling Peter to use his intelligence to help others. I thought about Carl, set on fire. I thought about Fred, smiling smugly. I thought about how Fred got out scot-free with no consequences and would go on hurting people because he was strong, rich, and popular. I looked at my chemistry set. With great power comes great responsibility. I don't know if I could make a super soldier serum, but I could try. It would be a few days before I saw Carl again. In that time, I started working on my little serum. I found little blogs and sites online that listed some formulas to try. Keep in mind that this was back in the late 2000s. The internet was a lot weirder and a lot less centralized. If you knew where to look, you could find some wild things. By the time I saw Carl at school again, his arm was all bandaged up. Fred gave a limp, probably forced apology, but still went out of his way to bully Carl. After a hellish day of school, we went to my house. So, I said, you know how we were talking about that super soldier serum thing? Carl raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Well, I said, then opened the door into my room to show him what I'd been up to. Flasks and cylinders filled with liquid lined the tops of my drawers. Various papers covered with formulas littered the floor. And most notably, lying on my desk was a tube of a green liquid. Carl looked at the tube. Is that? He asked. It's a prototype, I said. It's not quite done yet. I've still got to tweak some things. Carl pushed me out of the way and grabbed the tube. Carl, what are you doing? I asked. I'm getting some superpowers, Carl said. It's not done yet. It could kill you. Carl glared at me. And you think Fred won't? Fred literally set me on fire and got away with it. Imagine what he'll do next time. No, I'm doing this now. I won't be weak anymore. And with that, Carl drank the entire serum. He dropped the tube, shattering it on the floor. He fell to the ground, groaning in pain. Before my eyes, I watched him change. His normally skinny frame filled out, his muscles expanding and growing. He screamed as tendons stretched and bones expanded. I could do nothing but watch as my friend's body reshaped itself. And then, just like that, it was over. Carl was still. I walked over to him. Carl, you okay there? I asked. Carl opened his eyes and got up. He looked at his new body and flexed his muscles. Oh, I'm excellent. Carl punched my dresser, his fist going clean through its wooden frame. Carl pulled his fist back, looked at it, and smiled. He walked out of my room. I followed behind. Where are you going? I asked. I'm getting revenge, he said. He walked through the halls of my house as I followed behind. My parents were out, so only he and I were there. "Stop," I said. "We don't know what could happen. I need to make sure you aren't going to die or explode or..." I put my hand on Carl's back, then pulled it back as his skin burned me. What the hell, I thought. Carl pushed me away, knocking the wind out of my chest and sending me flying a good 10 feet back. He stared at me, shocked at what he just did, but then looked away. "Sorry, man," he said, "but I've got to do this." I tried to get up and follow after him as he left my house, but I was too hurt to do so immediately. It wasn't until around 10 minutes later that I was able to get up. I knew where he was going, and I knew what he was going to do. I just hoped I wasn't too late. The quickest way to Fred's house from mine would be to cut through the woods. I walked through them, cursing myself for not bringing a flashlight as I kept tripping over branches. As I was wondering how I'd even catch Carl, I heard a scream. I rushed towards it, branches slicing my clothes and skin. Suddenly, I saw a fire not too far from me. I ran over and saw that the blaze looked human. Oh my God. That was Carl. The serum set him on fire. Carl turned towards me. "Help me," he gasped. "It hurts." He stumbled around, his body setting every bit of foliage near him aflame. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "Please," he said, before he clutched his chest and fell over. His flames went out and I could see that every inch of his body was completely burned. There was no way he was alive. I went back home and called 911. I got rid of my notes, chemistry stuff, and Spider-Man poster. When the cops asked what happened, I made up some story about him being on drugs. Coroners ruled Carl's cause of death a heart attack, most likely from an unknown substance they found in his system. Cops assumed the fire came from him trying to light up whatever he was on and messing up. Carl was buried a few weeks later. The rest of high school was a blur for me. I just tried keeping my head down and moving on. I graduated, went to college, got a job, and tried putting what happened behind me. Then today, Carl's mom called me. She said that Carl's grave had been vandalized the night before. "Someone stole his body," she said. His coffin was open, and his body was gone. The police said that it looked like the inside of his coffin had been burned too. Who could even do something like that? And why would they do that to Carl? I didn't answer, as the only thing occupying my mind was a growing feeling of dread. After I got off the phone with her, I tried finding a way to contact Fred. I Googled him, hoping I could find a Facebook, Instagram phone number, or hell, even a MySpace account. Instead, I found a news article with the headline, "3 Dead in House Fire." Last night, Fred's home burned down with him, his wife and infant daughter inside. A neighbor caught a picture of the house while it burned. In the background, just out of focus, I could see a human-shaped figure engulfed in flame. "Glide me towards you." Vedder's soothing tone sat heavily in my bleary brain, washing the tiresome swirl of another long workday away. Sam plopped down next to me on the couch, turning the knob on the radio a bit lower before pouring some wine into the glasses that sat before us. She placed her hand on my shoulder, moving her thumb in rhythmic circles. "How was your day, baby?" Her voice carried like a melody of concern, angelic as it was quizzical. Work had been stressful, and Sam knew the long hours were beginning to wear on my tired, aching body. Caring would be an understatement to describe her. I decided to forego the glass and take a deep pull from the bottle instead. "Just another day, Bugs," I replied, meeting her curious eyes. I could feel the bags pulled tight underneath my eyes as I conjured up as sincere of a smile as I could. I hope I didn't look as rough as I felt. She returned a warm smile as she ran her hand over my cheek. "I'll put something on the TV. You should try to relax." "Take your shoes off," she said. Sam turned the radio off and squeezed my leg before hopping up to retrieve the remote. Suddenly, she froze. Her gaze seemed to be fixed on the living room window. I'll never forget her eyes. Her eyes, which always seemed so relaxed and worry-free, were now replaced with something else. Terror. Pure terror, as deer eyes are in the semi's headlights. "Babe," I said, wincing at the break in eerie silence. She remained still. Sam whimpered and backed away as I jumped up from the couch. I looked out the window and saw nothing. I moved closer, cautiously. The night was still, the speckled sky casting dimly over the empty street. There is not a soul to be seen. "What the hell's going on?" I turned to Sam, who was still cowering against the wall. I remember her eyes glazed with fear. She remained still, though her panic-stricken eyes drifted to me. Her body shook like a wanderer lost in a frozen tundra. Finally, she spoke. I saw someone looking in." Her voice cracked, hardly coming out above a whisper. I'd never seen her so scared before. I peered out the window once more, studying the intricacies of the night and pondering what might lurk in the darkest shadows near the parked cars. I shivered. "I don't see anything out there, baby," I said, feeling wholly unhelpful in easing her nerves. She stood now, carefully gliding back towards the couch. She brought the wine glass to her lips, the rim chattering against her teeth as she took a sip. She sighed. "Will you go out and check for me?" she asked, her green eyes beckoning like a lost pup. Despite my unease in entering the dark and the unsettling feeling which had begun to creep over me, I knew I couldn't say no. Of course. I tried my best to remain unwavering and play the part of the fearless boyfriend. Approaching the door, I grabbed the Louisville Slugger propped in the corner before heading outside. The neighbors are going to think I'm crazy, I thought, though I couldn't shake the fear and doubt that Sam's reaction had caused me. The night was cold, and when the wind blew, it was nearly unbearable. The end of fall was nearing at that point. It was the kind of cold that makes you lose all your other senses and drives the lizard part of your brain to seek shelter. The night hadn't been particularly dark, with the glowing stars illuminating much of the vacant street. Despite this, I pulled the flashlight from my pocket and swept over the front yard. Crunchy, amber leaves littered our yard in great piles, but aside from that, I couldn't make out anything that might raise alarms. Not yet, at least. I stomped through the leaf piles, nearing the corner of the house, to check our side yard. However, something stopped me. It felt as though thousands of strings had pulled the hair on the back of my neck up, the shiver of fear now replacing that of the cold. I looked through our front window, seeing Sam's shadow watch as I made my security sweep. God, I probably look like such a bitch. I stepped once, twice, holding my breath before poking my head around the corner. Nothing. More fallen foliage, and the buzzing heater had been waiting for me on the other side. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that Sam would be pleased that there wasn't some sort of deranged stalker on the loose. I stomped carelessly through the leaves, unconcerned about whatever ghoulish things might be watching from beyond the shadows. I stopped before the door, my mouth falling agape. Don't turn around, the page that had been freshly taped to our front door read. The world spun a bit, my heart throbbing angrily in my throat. I stood there for a moment, thoughts spinning wildly around my head. The feeling of being watched sat heavier now, my chest heaving up and down violently. No longer did it feel cold outside. I knew I didn't have long. I didn't have long before someone's axe would be sticking out of my back, and poor Sam would find me belly up on the front steps. With whatever courage I had left to muster up, if there was any to begin with, I spun on my heels. Again. Nothing. I'm not sure if that was worse or not. I took a step back, reaching behind me to tear the note off our door before sliding back inside. If Sam wasn't panicked before, I'm sure she was now, watching me frantically lock the door and shove the stopper underneath the handle. "What's going on? What did you see?" she practically screamed, running over towards me. I simply handed the crumpled sheet to her. Her eyes shot to and fro, reading the messy handwriting repeatedly, searching for answers that weren't there. She was as white as a sheet, her face twisting up as tears began to bubble up from the corners of her eyes. "I'm gonna lock the windows. You call the cops," I said, trying my best to look and sound like I hadn't already pissed my pants. After I was confident that all the windows in our bedroom and the kitchen were locked and the blinds had been drawn, I returned to the living room to find Sam sitting solemnly on the couch, her lip quivering as she cradled the phone in her hands. The phone's not working. They're just buzzing. I can't even dial anyone. She was trying hard not to completely lose it, her hands shaking violently as a steady stream of quiet, resigned tears fell down her cheeks. I held her close. I knew I had to hold my shit together, that I had to get us through the night and keep Sam calm. I walked over to the couch as nonchalantly as possible, keeping the bat handy as I sat down next to her. Why don't you put some TV on? We'll just ride the night out and leave in the morning. I don't think it's safe to go outside right now anyways. Sam winced, squeezing the phone tighter in her hands. I continued. Besides, it's probably just some idiots trying to mess with us. We remained on the couch like that for a long while, watching reruns of Judge Judy playing quietly on the television as the shadows of our home didn't seem so deep and threatening now. I'd been lying earlier, but maybe it really was just some dumb kids trying to play a prank on us. My nerves began to recede, and seeing Sam sleeping peacefully made me tired myself. The people bickering on the television had begun to warp into a mush of noise as my eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Sleep was on the horizon. Then, a fierce knock at the door shook us both wide awake. Date City Police Department. I'd like a quick word. An authoritative voice boomed from beyond the portal. Sam hopped up from the couch, eyeballing the front door as she took a cautious step forward. I pulled her back down. Wait a second, I said, turning to the window behind us to peek through the blinds. I'm not sure what I was planning to see. Perhaps some ghoulish figure dressed in all black waiting for his victims to unwittingly open the door. But standing at our doorstep was what appeared to be a regular, everyday officer. I breathed a sigh of relief and made my way towards the door, opening just a few inches so that the rest of my body was concealed. As silly as it may have been, I kept the bat in hand, tucked behind me. Hello, I blurted, unaware of how anxious I really was. The officer smiled and seemed to ease up a bit himself. Sorry to scare you, son. We've just been getting complaints in this area of someone. He paused for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Basically, someone's been leaving weird notes and looking through windows, knocking on everyone's doors, you know, he continued, his brows furrowing as he seemed to study my face. We both remained silent for a moment. Bring me that note, I said, motioning Sam over. I talked with the officer for a while, confirming that the very same thing had happened to us earlier that night. He kept our note as evidence, reassuring us that a squad car would patrol the street for the remainder of the night. Well, anyways, sorry to wake you folks up so late. I hope you can get some rest, he said, before turning to walk off. Thank you, sir. What was your name? I never got it. I'm not sure why I felt the need to ask, but the words just seemed to fall out. It's Mark. Officer Mark Weaver, sir, he replied as he continued the short walk back to his car. That was that, I suppose. The night continued on as it had before. We remained on the couch, the slugger still nearby, just in case. Once again, with the TV droning and the soft hum of the fan overhead, we found ourselves wrapped in each other's embrace, drifting merrily off to sleep. Peace wouldn't last so long this time. Another knock emanated from the front door maybe 20 minutes after it had happened the first time. It seemed frantic, with the quiet knocks coming in rapid succession. I'm not sure how long this had gone on before we both shot awake. Please, let me in. The voice on the other side sounded familiar, albeit more husky, seemingly wheezing and grunting in pain. I jumped up from the couch and peeked through the blinds once more, my eyes surely deceiving me and my dreaming brain surely conjuring up this horrible sight before me. I lingered there, watching the bloodied officer for a moment, my mouth surely agape. Sam darted for the door and opened it before I could say anything. allowing Officer Weaver to fall in a heap on our living room floor. Blood poured generously from the man's stomach, collecting in a ruby-colored pool on our floor. I winced at his pained groans. I have to commend Sam for her quick thinking in that moment, running to the bathroom to get a towel as I stood there like a bumbling idiot. The officer and I remained there. His guttural cries were the only thing penetrating the stillness, the silence. Sam returned with the towel, shoving it in my hands and instructing me to put weight on the officer's wound. As I fumbled with the towel and attempted to pull Mark out of the fetal position he was in, I could hear Sam putting her shoes and a coat on. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "I'm going to get help. Stay here with him," she said, frantically trying to pull the other shoe off her foot before making her way towards the door. "No, don't," Mark said between labored breaths. Finally, he turned over to face us. His face had turned a sickening pallor. "There's two," he said, taking a moment and clutching at his gushing abdomen. "There's two of them out there. They have knives," he continued, pulling up his shirt to show the severity of his injury. From what I could see, before the gash filled once more with the red stuff, it didn't look good. Sam had covered her eyes, blocking the heinous scene. I could hear her whispering to herself, whispering soft prayers to a god she'd denounced long, long ago. "To take this. Stay here till the others come," Mark wheezed, using whatever strength he had left to unclip the firearm from its holster. He shoved the thing into my shaky hands. I'm not sure if Sam or I would have been the better candidate at that point to use the gun, but it seemed he'd made the decision for us. I looked over at Sam, who'd taken up residence on the floor, her head tucked between her knees. The soft whispering and the soft prayers continued. Suddenly, the officer began to violently rattle. The husky wheezing is now replaced by sharp, painful croaks before finally falling still. "Oh, fuck." The words seemed to just fall from my mouth. I dropped to my knees beside the officer, clutching at his still warm arm as my mind began to swirl down the drain of resignation. I could feel hot tears begin to well up. Our cries, our pleas for help for the officers, and for some sort of deity to come to our rescue were soon replaced with more violent knocks on the door. They seemed more angry this time, unrelenting. Sam glowered at the floor, crawling as quickly as possible to the wall of posts at the front door. I planted my back against the wall next to her, readying the gun in my hand, even with the front door being 10 or so feet away. I'd be lucky to hit anything with how fiercely my hands had been shaking. The constant knocking seemed to slow before being replaced with something much more sinister. Beyond the door, I could hear soft scratches, much like a cat trying to escape a room or cage they're locked in. The scratches grew heavier, turning into heavy scrapes that squealed along the length of the door. The meese of Sam's crease and the scraping on the door filled the room, sending me into a fit of dizzying nausea. Finally, however, the scraping seemed to come to an end. My raw, bleary eyes drifted towards the dead cop on our floor before shifting to the door, which concealed whatever horrors might lay beyond it. Sam cried softly next to me. Hopelessness. I dropped my head back into the wall, which created an audible bang that made Sam jump. All I could do was laugh. Perhaps this is what the gladiators felt as they lay on the gritty arena floor, a sword threatening to puncture their throat. A heinous crash sent glass splintering down to the kitchen floor. Then silence. I jumped up, readying the gun as adrenaline replaced my resolved demeanor. The kitchen was concealed in the corner of the living room, concealing the monsters that had taken up residence in our once peaceful home. In our home. In our home. A surge of anger pushed me forward and around the corner as I attempted to empty the clip. The firearm only clicked with every pull of the trigger. Click, click, click. I stepped back in horror, realizing it had never been loaded. I looked up from the gun. A brick lying on the floor had been the culprit of the broken window. What a waste of bullets that would have been. I threw the gun down, shuffling closer now to the brick which laid in a heap of shattered glass. Another note was attached. "We're Al Reedy inside." I hardly had time to read the zannily written note before Sam's scream caught me off guard. I spun on my heels, ready to give whoever threatened my baby a fight like hell. Sam and the officer's body were gone. I looked to the front door, which was now hanging wide open, the cold fall air passing gently over my boiling skin. I darted for the door, giving the assailants as little time as possible to get away. It's strange. I was no longer afraid of what might happen to me. I reached the door looking out into the night. Among the pools of crunchy amber leaves among the still parked cars stood a man dead in the center of the walkway leading to our home. From what I could see, through the shadows of the night, he wore a white dress shirt neatly tucked into his brown slacks. His hair was slicked back. He began to approach the door, making the sawed-off shotgun in his hand apparent as he tapped it against his thigh. "Fucking do it, fucking shoot me," I screamed through gritted teeth. "Leave her out." I was cut short, a rough arm taking a hold of my neck from behind. I tried to scream and wiggle my way out, but whoever had me was much stronger. The stranger in front of me drew closer as the world began to fade to black. Despite my struggles, despite having my love taken away from me, there was nothing I could do. The last thing I remember seeing was the butt of his shotgun. When I awoke, when I opened my eyes again, the world remained black. My hands were bound, and my head was buzzing and swirling like the gnarliest hangover one could endure. I tried to move, to stand up from the chair I had found myself bound to. I slumped backward, my mind dulled beyond the point of caring. I could hear someone sniffling near me, struggling against what I assumed to be their own restraints. The pain from trying to speak and cry out for help was so immense that it seemed to shock me out of my stupor. All that I could muster were soft groans and pathetic whimpering. "Josh," said Sam, her voice quivering even worse than it had earlier. Her distress continued. "Josh, is that you?" She grew frantic. I couldn't speak. The pain in my jaw was searing throughout my entire face. The butt of his shotgun must have broken it. Was all that I could manage, but even that felt agonizing. I'm not sure how long we remained seated there wherever we were, bound to those chairs. Minutes, hours, days. I'm really not sure. The only thing I knew was that a burlap sack had been placed over my head, its rough material beginning to rub the tip of my nose raw. I sat quietly, the silence occasionally broken by Sam pleading and whimpering. After calming a bit, I'd come to the conclusion that we were still home. Still in the living room, no less. The very same reruns of Judge Judy continued on in the background. The very same reruns we'd watched peacefully before our world came crashing down. Beyond the two of us, it was utterly silent, with nothing stirring in the room around us. A long time passed before rescue finally arrived. I could hear several voices and several more beyond that on the radios that the police who'd entered our home had with them. Eventually, we were freed from our restraints, having been tied down with baling twine to our own chairs. Despite a black eye and various bruises, Sam seemed to be all right. Physically, at least. I wasn't so lucky. My jaw had been broken, as I suspected, along with several teeth having been knocked out in the process. My entire body felt black and blue. The police gave us a once-over, determining that we hadn't sustained any life-threatening injuries. They questioned us as much as possible, investigators and neighbors outside, and were eager to see what had happened. One of the officers, whose name I don't recall, showed us a sheet of paper they'd found hung from our front door. Unlike the other notes that had been left before, this one was written in a much finer script. Home Intrusion Preparedness Test. This home had been thoroughly studied and the behaviors of its occupants researched before testing took place. We determined that the two occupants were in their mid to late 20s and had minimal to no security system in place, including alarms, weapons, pets, etc. Very limited action was taken before the occupants succumbed to fear, allowing their emotions to cloud good judgment. The home invasion took place at approximately 10:15 p.m. and concluded at approximately 11:50 p.m. after the occupants had been subdued. Taking all of this into consideration, it's with our best judgment that we give this house a D+ on our preparedness scale. We can only hope that future homes yield better results. Truly, I wish I could say that was the end of it, that the nightmare had finally ended. Despite all of this, despite the chilling note they'd left, I'll never forget seeing Mark Weaver standing among those crowding our front yard as they escorted us to the ambulance. To this day, 17 years later, no one has been caught for what they did to us.